Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Nelson Talks. We're going to give everyone just a couple more minutes to log in, so stand by and we'll be back in a minute. Thank you. Good morning again, and welcome to Nelson Talks. We are pleased to have everyone here today and hope you and yours are safe and healthy. Today's presentation is a part of our ongoing Nelson Talks series, the live and online event we've hosted for years. Today's Nelson Talks is a continuation of the webinar we hosted in April, where we had over 800 people register. The topic, Navigating COVID-19 as a California Business, generated insightful questions that prompted today's follow-up webinar. This morning, we will focus on the future of California business in a COVID-19 environment, and in particular, the economic, legal, employment impacts on your company. Hi, my name is Chandra Pappas. I'm the Executive Vice President at Nelson, and I'm excited to moderate today's event. We're pleased to have three outstanding speakers here with us today to give us more insight on our business environment in light of the ongoing pandemic. I'm going to kick off with just a few mandatory housekeeping items. First, I will introduce all the speakers, and then after their presentations, we're going to move into a live Q&A. Because of the extreme popularity of our last event and the number of questions people asked, we scheduled today's session for an hour and 15 minutes. If you do have questions for our speakers, just type the question into the GoToWebinar question box at any time. It's anonymous, and we'll respond to as many questions as we can in the time allotted. All attendees will automatically be on mute. We are recording today's session, and we will send out the link to the recording after the webinar. The speaker slides will also be available, and we'll send a link for those as well. We are offering SHRM and HRCI educational credits for today's session. If you signed up for a credit, we will email your certificate after the webinar. Please note that the information we're presenting today is for general purposes only and does not constitute legal or medical advice. With that, I'm happy to introduce our guest speakers. First, I would like to welcome Dr. Robert Eiler. Many of you joining today know Dr. Eiler through the Nelson Talks series. He is an economist, business advisor, academic, expert witness in interstate trade litigation, forensic economist. He is high demand for his spot-on analysis of the ever-changing economic climate, and very, very popular Nelson Talks speaker. Dr. Eiler is President of Economic Forensics and Analytics and also Dean of the School of Extended and International Education, as well as Professor of Economics at Sonoma State University, where he has taught for over 25 years. Dr. Eiler is joining us from his home office in Sonoma County. Welcome, and thank you very much, Dr. Eiler, for joining us today. Our legal expert is, you're welcome. Our legal expert attorney is Jennifer Shaw, who joins us from Sacramento, hot Sacramento. Over the years, Jennifer has been a great partner with Nelson, providing excellent educational sessions and trainings to both our internal and larger Nelson community. Thank you, Jennifer, for your ongoing support and partnership. We really appreciate it. Jennifer is the founder of Shaw Law Group. Over the course of the last 25 years, employers rely on her advice and counsel on a broad range of employment law issues, including wage hour compliance, reasonable accommodation, leave of absence, hiring, and separation. Over the last 11 years, Northern California Super Lawyers magazine has named her as one of the top attorneys in California. Jennifer is a frequent speaker on employment law topics and a regular guest on CNN and local television and radio. Jennifer is California educated with a Bachelor of Arts degree in economics with honors from UC Santa Cruz, and she graduated magna cum laude from University of San Francisco School of Law, where she was the editor-in-chief in the Law Review. Welcome, Jennifer, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Our next speaker, I've been very fortunate to know and work alongside Alex. So I think it's been over 10 years, Alex. I tried to count it yesterday. And it kind of got me a little depressed with how time has flown. But Alex oversees our Nelson's direct hire search practice as Vice President of Executive Search. Alex is 20 plus years in executive search, including leadership roles with the world's largest and most esteemed international recruiting organizations. He was also the founder of a boutique firm that focused on retained search. His deep industry insight and business acumen helps clients build their professional teams that position their organizations for success. Alex's blended experience in working with executives who are hiring critical members to their teams while simultaneously representing candidates across the globe will help us understand his particular topic, employment and remote work issues related to COVID-19. Alex, welcome. It's now my pleasure. Thank you. It's now my pleasure to turn it over the presentation to our first speaker, Dr. Eiler, who will discuss California's economic issues related to COVID-19. Dr. Eiler, it's all yours.
Thanks so much, Chandra. Folks, thanks for coming today, and I hope that what I'm going to tell you is educational and also makes you think about where we're going here. It's a lot of wild data out there, and it's a very dynamic environment. Next slide, please. So this has really become a tale of three policies, and we're hearing right now in the news that Congress is going through potentially another relatively large spending bill, and we will see how that ultimately breaks down in terms of what's really coming to both businesses and households. But it started with a monetary policy move, meaning that rates fell down back to where we were at the end of the Great Recession, and then the fiscal policy package that included payments at home, loan programs like PPP, EIDL, other programs that Congress put together through SBA and other agencies to try to boost the economy back up, assuming that we would have a smooth transition out. And those two policies together were meant to offset the negative of the social policies that we've basically put ourselves under and put our economy in hibernation for some time. As we're waking up from that hibernation, the hope is that the combination of the two positive policies outweighs the negative through their multiplier effects and through a natural way in which they so-called accommodate each other, which is a classic move when we go into relatively deep economic downturns. Next slide. This is a forecast from mid-May that happened right after the first quarter ended, and 40 economists are interviewed every quarter by the Philadelphia Federal Reserve to talk about the American economy and its forward progress. So you'll see here that there's two sets of data. For one's the previous forecast, and the next one is the new forecast. And again, this is in May for the next few quarters going forward and also the next few years. And I'm keep emphasizing May because that seems like it was a million years ago, and I'll get back to that in a minute. That first set that's now highlighted is the growth of GDP in the American economy over the next few quarters. You'll see a very deep negative number in that first box, which is negative 32.2. I'll come back to where we're at after some other forecasts have evolved here in just a second, but the key is that for most economists, even in May, the idea is that at some point the initial contraction would end and we would smoothly start to move out of this. So notice that for quarters 3 and 4 in 2020, quarters 1 and 2 in 2021, these 40 economists, this is the median forecast, so their middle forecast was that we would start to see relatively strong growth coming out of the third and fourth quarter and into 2021 after we fell very deeply into a hole by going into economic hibernation. Next slide, or next click, please. This is the unemployment rate as contrasted to the growth of productivity or income, which is GDP growth in that first shaded column. Unemployment rates were seen as peaking around 16.1. So far, the American economy has beat those numbers for right now, but that you'd see the slow slide that would come along with productivity growth in the third and fourth quarter down toward where we started this, which was relatively low unemployment, but it would at least start that path. Notice that by the end of the fourth quarter here, they're saying we'd be right around 11%. And then in 2021, we would be midway through be at 8.8. So those are still relatively high historic numbers for unemployment rate. The key is notice that in both cases, the strong growth of GDP is not necessarily bringing jobs back at what you could say a very quick speed. and we're going to have to deal with this issue for some time. So on the next click, you'll see this is the annual forecast. So then there's negative growth forecasted for 2020 at this stage, and then positive growth for the next couple of years. And the growth in 2021 and 22 currently forecasted is actually more robust than we've seen recently annually. But then we're kind of back in baseline by 2023. And if you go to the next click, the unemployment rate evolution starts about 11% again at the end of the year 2020, and then the next couple of years it starts to fall back down toward where we started. But the column that's not shaded next door to that shaded column, you'll see that with before COVID, which is that other set of data, we were expecting sort of slow and steady growth, not much change in employment and or unemployment. And by the end of 2023, we're still not back at the baseline unemployment rate we expected before COVID at the end of 2023. So the idea is that what COVID-19 and our social policies and choices have done has contracted the economy in such a way that we don't expect as economists to see a full recovery until potentially 2023. Now, thing to think about, the next click will show you that while these numbers are only a couple months old, they might as well come out when the dinosaurs were roaming the earth, because it really is so dynamic out there that 1 month ago, 2 months ago, the data are very archaic. Next slide. What the New York Federal Reserve has done is they are looking at more high frequency data and high frequency forecasts to give a weekly update to the growth rate of GDP. So where the negative 32.2 we see in the forecast for May for the second quarter, that left-hand panel shows you the dynamics of where we've gone on a weekly basis. And on the next click, you'll see that as of just last week, the second quarter is now predicted at negative 14.3. Now you might say, hey man, negative 14.3 is still pretty nasty. And the answer is absolutely. We had a nasty quarter and we should expect a real contraction. But on the next click, you'll see that for the third quarter, or I'm sorry, for that evolution, that red part is where we were in May. So notice that that's lingering around the negative 30s. And then since then, because we've started to see our economy waking up across the board, we've seen the forecast for the second quarter get better and better and better from where we were at sort of the bottom, and now we're at negative 14.3. If you click again, you'll see on the third quarter forecast, that actually is more robust than we originally expected. And on the next click, you'll see that evolution's been straight uphill and then petered off a little bit. Notice that the original ascension in both forecasts have tailed off a little bit, and that's because while we had really good reopening momentum, a lot of states, including California, have started to peel back a little bit, and that retrograde has led to a little flattening of these forecasts. Next click, please. One reason why those forecasts have gotten better is because we've seen an evolution in unemployment data, and one of the pieces to watch on a regular basis that's more real time is what an economist would call continued claims for unemployment insurance. So the unemployment insurance world from a data standpoint is kind of bifurcated into two groups that feed off of each other. The first one is initial claims for unemployment, which is I lose my job and I go and ask for unemployment insurance. And what that's supposed to do is it's supposed to measure the depth of unemployment. What continuing claims do are tell us the number of weeks that we've paid unemployment insurance. So the more people that go on unemployment, the more weeks of unemployment payments we're making as an economy. And these numbers ascend. So you'll notice this is from January 2020 forward to just about 2 weeks ago, which are the latest data. And you can see that they ran right straight uphill, peaked. The black using the left-hand axis is the US. The blue using the right-hand axis is California. Peaked, had some wobbliness, but have been trending basically down with a little bit in California of, in a sense, a slowdown in that trend and some flattening going into June and early July. We should expect this to kick back up a little bit because we have stopped the growth in California to a certain extent in some industries and actually have asked for shutdowns in certain counties. So we're watching the evolution of these data, but these data, instead of showing the depth of the situation, talk more about the duration. And the combination of those two is the powerful piece of this. Monetary and fiscal policy are meant to cut down on the depth, shorten the duration. And so looking at the labor markets through both those lenses, initial claims and continuing claims are meant to look at depth and duration respectively. So the sliding down of continuing claims should mean that we're starting to see some shrinkage of the duration of this issue as people are coming off unemployment and potentially getting a job. The one caveat is that people might come off unemployment and then may leave the labor force because they become discouraged with the potential. And this is one of the nasty things about measuring unemployment, and this is one of the banes of economists' existence, is that it's not a perfect way of measuring labor markets. We have to think about whether or not changes in unemployment actually lead to people getting a job or leaving the labor force completely. Next slide, please. Let's look at the breakdown. This is in the US economy of the sectoral changes since April. So in April, which is the next click, you'll see there were changes across the board. And really, I wanted you to focus on the far right-hand side. Where we really got hammered, which makes anecdotal sense as well, is in other services, which are things like hair salons, nail salons, etc., food services and drinking places, basically bars and restaurants, and then accommodation, which is hotels. So that's where we really saw sort of the screeching halt. But then in May, the US economy saw some give back in other services, personal services again. Bars and restaurants started to open up again. And then we saw the sort of final stand of the contraction in hotels as people stopped really traveling after that and really put a hold on their movements. Now in June, which is the next click you'll see, we saw some get back across the board. And this is why the forecasts have gotten better as well, because not only have we seen unemployment change, but that the jobs coming back, people are getting their jobs back, getting their income back going again. And we've seen even the most damaged industries start to come back somewhat. If you go back across the left-hand side, you'll see that a bunch of those other industries that did not suffer as much of a contraction since the previous year have shown also some small get back. And then the far left-hand side, which is total non-farm jobs, which is one of the driving data points for watching an economy, we've seen that slowly crawl back up to where we're getting less and less negative growth since the previous year. And these are all measured against last year in that month to try to reduce any seasonality that might jump into the data. Next slide, please. That was the US data. Now here are the California data to give some contrast. So this is April. Very similar story. If you look at the far right-hand side, again, other services, those personal services, food and drinking places, bars and restaurants, and then hotels, or what is categorically known as accommodation, were the three big sufferers. In May, we'll see that sort of the same dynamics. And then in June, we saw some get back again. So those dynamics, all very similar for California, all kind of the same movements, but in the end of the day, we're still seeing a lot of consternation in specific industries that really got hammered coming out of the gate. And as we move forward through the end of summer, we'll see whether or not we have our tourism industries come back. Next slide. Here's just a quick wrap up on the data in May. Oh, I'm sorry, this is actually June. This is not labeled correctly. I apologize for that. These are the June data for the changes in California. So two pieces of the data. One, unemployment still around 16%, even after seasonal adjustment. The other piece is the labor force change. The labor force change is negative 4.4% since the previous June. Now, why that's important is because as the data have evolved, one of the things economists have been very concerned about are people leaving the labor force. And there's two reasons why people generally leave the labor force. One is because they become discouraged with the job market, but unemployment insurance benefits rising were meant to keep people engaged in actively seeking work, which is a definitional aspect of being counted as unemployed, at least in theory. But the other piece is people may be retiring. So if people are leaving the labor force because they are retiring, it doesn't mean their economic lives are ending. They just may be shifting away from payroll employment, which this really focuses on, and going into something else. But as the economy slowly evolves and does not come back rapidly, that's one of the things we have to watch in terms of the changing aspect of people's lives. If I'm 65 years old and I retire, but I see myself as a consultant, I might be generating income, but in a more dynamic negative environment, I might not have the same opportunities I would have had 2 years ago if I'd chosen to retire then. So we're watching that evolution of the labor force very closely to really get a feel of the total picture of the employment situation in California. Next slide, please. One of the questions I get asked a lot is, what did the PPP lending really do for California? And that's an evolving question. We will see how many businesses were saved. And that was the real reason, folks, and this is a critical factor. Monetary and fiscal policies I talked about right off the top became very, very accommodative and also stimulative, if you will, because we were trying to save businesses from closing. Job losses come with recession all the time. It's businesses closing that contract the capacity of the economy in a way that can structurally change our ability to recover, because those businesses are not there anymore to rehire. And a business that closes its doors doesn't suddenly come back 2 weeks later and go, okay, well, things are better, now I'm going to start up again. That time frame can leave a large gap in recovery. And that's really why those two policies were put together so quickly and with such large magnitudes. One portion of the fiscal policy was the so-called Paycheck Protection Plan lending that happened at the beginning of the recession. And this was the way in which industries in California borrowed in that plan by industry sector. And you can see professional and technical services, health care and social assistance, where social assistance is ostensibly nonprofit healthcare for the most part. Other services, as we talked about before, accommodation and food services, the combination of bars, restaurants, and hotels, and retail and construction were some of the big takers on smaller loans. So these are really about smaller businesses and the way in which lending took place. We will see how many of these businesses are really here in a few quarters when the official data start to come out. But locally, your local cities and counties will have data on business licenses and how many of those expired and how few have actually jumped back in terms of new businesses starting, as one way of gauging it somewhat indirectly. The official data on how many payroll businesses remain won't come out for a few more quarters. But these are the smaller loans. Now, if we go to the next slide, you're going to see the larger loans that were taken, and the mix is not that much different. What is intriguing is that the bigger ones are in accommodation in bars and restaurants, and that's probably because the larger hotels, seeing that tourism was one of the most harmed industries, started to take a large number of those PPP loans off the top. But then healthcare and social assistance, manufacturing, bigger firms there started to jump in. The professional and technical services, again, a lot of our legal firms, engineering, accounting firms, construction, retail, and then the other services. One of the reasons why you saw smaller lending volume in these larger loans for things like other services is because a lot of small businesses are in other services, not a lot of large ones. So these larger loans change the mix a little bit, though in some, it's not that big of a difference. The key is to recognize that these are meant to, in a sense, save businesses through conserving jobs. So if you could keep people on payroll and keep your doors open, that worked. Why that's important is because if we see on the other side of our recovery, those businesses go away and job opportunities structurally change, it can start to affect housing markets. So this next slide, please click again, thank you, is something we're watching. This is the median listing price. So usually when you see the paper and they talk about housing, they talk about the median home price. This is the median listing price, or the middle of the distribution in which homes in California are being listed for sale. One of the things economists are very concerned about is we would see, even with lower interest rates and in a sense some economic uncertainty, we kind of expected demand to be there, but we weren't quite sure. And so the listing price kind of gives you a way of foreseeing change, that if I really want to sell my home, just like in any other market, the easiest way to do that is put it up at a low price. We haven't really seen that yet in California. So on the front end of this situation, we're assuming that the housing market is relatively stable, but folks, be very cautious. Next click, please. I'll just highlight that far right-hand side. Be very cautious before you get too cocky about where the housing market's going. We don't want long durations of unemployment. The critical factor here is how long unemployment will remain relatively high. Because if that starts to create rental vacancy, and that gives me an opportunity as a homeowner to sell my home but stay in the same area and rent for a little while and let the market clear out, that could lead to a lot of houses going up. And when supply exceeds demand, that's when prices go down in markets. So this is giving some early indications that that momentum has not happened yet, but be very cautious before you think, oh yeah, we got this in housing. If unemployment lasts, let's say above 10% into next year, or it goes back up again in the fall, you might see a little bit more tenuousness in terms of housing markets, and the end of unemployment insurance that is coming in terms of that additional boost might put a lot of renters on the edge of not being able to easily stay in their homes without some other assistance. So we're watching rental market dynamics as well as those for sale. Next slide, please. I was asked briefly to talk about the cannabis market, and though I am not a cannabis entrepreneur myself, this market is something we're watching very closely in California, because there was a lot of momentum going in. The state of California is intended to derive a lot of tax revenue. And one of the things that I wanted to point out was the harvest aspect of cannabis is similar to any other agriculture. They need workers to harvest. They need consumers to want to buy. So far, we feel like the cannabis market has stayed relatively stable, that people have still bought on the legal side. But one of the things about the increase in cost of doing business is that you might see more backyard operations begin, or less conversion, because the cost of doing business has gone up. And if the regulatory cost is already relatively high on the margin, you might have fewer businesses that want to make the choice to go in to the legal side of the market. And if the demand's still there, there'll be incentives to at least do something and sell on the illegal side. And so that's something to watch in cannabis that's very nerve-wracking about the way that we've evolved into this legal situation with cannabis, is that we're trying to provide an incentive to convert to a legal business, But what COVID-19 has done is exacerbate the cost of doing business in such a way that it's probably going to put more businesses on the margin of staying either in the sort of gray area on the illegal and legal side or not converting at all. One of the things that might do to California is it might slow down what their original projections were for tax revenues derived from that industry, because there's fewer conversions than they expected. So that's, in a sense, a wrap up of what's going on in the cannabis world based on COVID-19. It's similar to almost every other piece of agriculture, except for the fact that per volume, it's a lot higher revenue for the state of California and also for the businesses themselves. Last slide, please. So what to watch? So what economists are watching, which seems very obvious, is the labor market, but it's really now sort of slowly transitioning into, okay, we've seen the wave come through. Now, is that wave, the continuing claims, are they evolving in such a way that the duration of the crisis is starting to show some end? Furthermore, we're watching housing markets to see how the labor market then ultimately translates into potential shocks in housing. For California, the key is, will we be able to reopen in a continuous and smooth fashion? We've already seen a couple of bumps in the road, and the bumps are more focal. They're not generalized, but we will see how that starts to affect our urban areas and whether or not our rural and suburban areas see a renaissance in all this, where people say, okay, I'm now done living in the city. My job is portable from a labor market standpoint, and you're going to hear probably some more about this later today. Will we see some movement away, and how does that affect productivity? So for California, especially on the portable job side, we might see some shuffling, but a lot of that depends on the housing market and ultimately how businesses see their own productivity going forward. So thank you again for having me, and I'm waiting for your questions for later. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Eiler. I know in our green room, we were talking about anecdotally how rents are vacant and just in the Oakland, San Francisco area. And to hear it in context of everything else, it really puts it into, it could be a foreshadowing. The other thing I listening to you is unemployment and employment capacity, and are people coming in or out of retirement. Those were conversations that we had during the last recession. And so to hear it again is a little daunting. The good news is we're waking up a little bit. So that was, I did take that away as a little bit of a good news. So thank you. Always incredibly insightful.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you. Let's move to Jennifer Shaw. So our next speaker is Jennifer Shaw, and she's going to speak about return to work legal issues related to COVID-19. And welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Shan.
Thank you.
So there are only a couple slides here, folks, because we have a lot to talk about, and I just want to sort of do a little rundown for you since we have such a short amount of time to talk. There are some key issues that every industry, by the way, including cannabis, needs to be focused on, all right? And when we look at return to work issues, keep in mind that many employers that are essential employers, have essential employees, they haven't really gone anywhere, right? They may be teleworking or they may have reduced capacity, but there are actually many employers that have not actually shut down or have shut down and come back and are now shutting down again, as we've talked about. So the employment law side of things is always very interesting when you look at economic changes, you look at social changes, you look at what's going on. And certainly COVID has been no different. I mean, I feel like I haven't had a good night's sleep in about 4 months, trying to keep up with all of the changes when it comes to the federal guidance, the state guidance, the local ordinances. What are you supposed to do? How are you supposed to do it? So the good news is, for today, we're going to focus on a relatively narrow area of these issues, which is, how do we get people back to work? And what are the legal issues that come back with those employees, right? What are the legal issues that sort of come into play? Now, when I say come back to work, remember, many employers have been operating, right? But we are now often coming back to the workplace. So we're getting out of telework, moving back into the workplace. There are also, of course, many employers that have said, I'm not interested in coming back. I'm going to let my lease go. Everyone's going to telework. So there's a lot going on here in terms of older employment laws, right? You know, the basic stuff we've always known about: wage hour law, equal employment opportunity, compliance, reasonable accommodation, that sort of thing. But with a COVID spin. And the COVID spin is where things are getting, quite honestly, pretty complicated. So let's look at the legal risks that are associated with teleworking, because this is really, I think, what folks have been looking at, where they want to do business, right? And they want to be, quote, returning to work, but many of them are working at home. Either they're working at home because they have a right to take time off, families first, right? We have the emergency temporary child care FMLA leave, the expanded leave. We have the COVID-19 sick leave. We have food sector rules. Many cities, including Sacramento, have adopted their own ordinances about returning to work, teleworking, etc. So we can go back to the prior slide for a second, if you don't mind, because we've got a lot to talk about on that one. So I first want to talk about telework. Okay, I want to talk about, what do you do when your workplace has either gone from being in office to telework, or maybe it's always been telework, but you just haven't really thought about these issues? The first one, of course, is wage hour. So you know that when you deal with exempt employees, people who are paid a fixed salary that does not vary based on the quantity or quality of their work, that we're not going to dictate really how many hours a week they're going to work. We're not going to dictate when they take rest breaks and meal periods. We just need them to get the job done. So in that way, having exempt employees telework is relatively easy. Now, there are challenges that come up in terms of folks who may not be as productive as they should be. We're paying them for full-time work. It appears they're not working more than a couple of hours a day. Those are performance issues, right? But from a wage hour perspective, much easier to deal with these exempt employees. The non-exempt folks, the ones who need to be paid overtime, who have to take rest breaks and meal periods where we have to record their hours worked, those are more tricky, right? Because for many of us, those employees have worked a regular schedule pre-COVID where it wasn't really flexible, right? They came to the office potentially or to the work site. They had a certain number of hours they were working. It was all very regimented. With telework, it's just not happening that way. Particularly if you run telework alongside of these leave entitlements that some employees have, where, look, my kid's not in school. You know, I had a slight anxiety attack the other day when the email came out for our school district. And then the governor really closed the door, right? Because the governor said, hey, school's not starting in the fall. Private school, public school, not happening. So I went back to thinking about, all right, I'm a lawyer, I'm a business owner, I'm a mom, I'm a single mom. You know, now I'm a school teacher again, like, ooh. So I got to do a lot of strategizing for that. And what happens with non-exempt employees is when they're home trying to deal with the dog, the kids, the dinner, the laundry, everything else that's going on, they may not be able to work their set schedule of 8 to 10, take a 15-minute break, 10:15 to noon, then take lunch for an hour, then come back from 1, take a break at 3. You know, that's just not going to work necessarily. So the wage hour compliance issues and risks you have are really tied to what you've always supposed to be doing, right? I'm supposed to have been doing, managing what people are doing, how they're doing it, when they're doing it, how they're getting paid for it. One of the additional things we have to think of with teleworking, though, is the reimbursement for people who are now working at home, and they want to know, well, it costs me more money now because now the lights are on all day and the AC's on all day, and you want me to have special fast internet, which I never had before. What am I supposed to do there? Well, based on some court decisions, some guidance we're getting from the labor commissioner, what employers really need to understand is you've got to reimburse for the reasonable and necessary work-related expenses of all of your employees. So is it reasonable for me to say, hey, my electricity's gone up a little bit because I'm now home all day, or you asked me to get this faster internet, it's costing me $30 more a month? Sure, that's all reasonable. Here's our recommendation, though. You're not going to go through and try to figure out exactly how much the person is entitled to. That is a legal trap, because what we're going to try to do is figure out, okay, they have a family internet plan. Well, what percentage of the usage is attributable to the work environment? Pretty hard to do, pretty hard to support. Our strong recommendation is a flat fee. We're going to give you a stipend, $75 a month, for example. There's no required amount. We think this is going to cover absolutely everything you may have to deal with as a teleworker. And if you don't think it does, the burden's on you to come back to us to tell us. Puts the employer in a much different place than trying to evaluate statements and go looking at, well, what percentage of the network was being used for this and for that. just give them a flat amount and tell them, if you don't think it's covering what I'm asking you to do, paper, toner, printer cartridges, you name it. If you don't think it's being covered, you come back to me and we'll talk about how to do that. So the wage hour issues are really requiring us to still focus on compliance, but do it in a little bit more of a flexible way. Safety issues. Okay, telework. When they're at home, you're still responsible for their safety. How are you supposed to do that? You're not at their house with them. Many times you don't see where they're working, right? So again, you put the burden on the employee. You say to the employee, look, you need to make sure you have a comfortable place to work. You need to make sure you have a place where you're not going to trip over wires. If you have a safety issue, you need to let us know. We think it's really important to have a COVID-19 telework agreement, so that is particularly for people who have not regularly been teleworking. You want to get all of these issues really nailed down so everybody's on board. If you haven't done that already, do it now. It's fine. It's okay. You can say, look, the governor just opened us up. We're going to be doing this for a little longer than we thought. So we're going to roll out a COVID-19 telework policy. That is where you can really address the safety issues. Now, the other type of safety, of course, that comes up that unfortunately many of us don't want to think about, but it's there, is domestic violence, child abuse. Everybody's home. They're all crammed together. Everybody's working a really tough schedule. The incidence of suicide hotline calls, domestic violence hotline calls, child abuse referrals to our child abuse agencies has skyrocketed. So I would like you in your COVID-19 remote policy to remind people, hey, if you don't feel safe at home for any reason, we want you to come to us. We've got resources. Make that reach out. This is an incredibly stressful time for people. And we all have programs through our healthcare, through just programs we've purchased for our employees, where you can go get some help. But you've got to let your employees know that those programs are out there. What about equal employment opportunity compliance, harassment prevention? One of my CEOs said to me the other day, thank gosh, everybody's home. Now I won't have any sexual harassment claims. 20 minutes later, 2 employees complain about some Zoom activity during one of their happy hours for the company, right? You got to be on top of EEO compliance. Not only is there a training deadline the end of this year for the mandated California harassment prevention training, you got to let people know what your expectations are while they're teleworking. Don't think it's a free-for-all. And people have this crazy idea that if I'm home and I'm on my private Facebook page and I'm in my PJs, it's not work-related. It's not where you are, it's who you are with, who can access your conduct. That's what we're talking about. So be very careful about that. Excuse me, productivity and discipline. Listen, those of us who are control freaks, and I definitely put myself in this universe, you got to let go. You are not going to necessarily know how productive someone is being teleworking. My sort of approach to this is use a little grace and assume everybody's doing their best. If you get evidence that they aren't, you can take action, you can discipline, you can impose corrective action. But honestly, you will drive yourself crazy if you try to match the statistics of what's somebody doing at home with what somebody doing at work. I have found, much to my surprise, that some of our employees are actually more productive at home. I am not one of those employees. I have been coming to work the entire time, sitting in my office by myself, because I'm just not a good at-home worker. I can think of so many things that I want to do: make cookies with my daughter, paint a new painting, redecorate my living room. There's a million things I want to do. So for my brain, I need to be at work. But many people are being more productive teleworking. So don't assume that just because someone is teleworking that they're not being productive. Not the case, right? You're going to have to manage and monitor the productivity based on the output. All right? All right, we can go to the next slide, please. Now, after your telework time is over, which for some companies they're saying we may never come back. We might come back in January of 2021. We're not really sure. When you're ready to return people to work, you've got to do it safely. We have a weekly webinar series, and my topic today, this morning, was the training that you have to give to employees on COVID-19 prevention. You can't just dump people back at work and expect them to know what they need to do. The world has done a 180. I mean, whoever thought that we'd be going around worried about where our masks are, right? I mean, it's ludicrous. And now, of course, you can get the Burberry mask and the fancy pants mask. You know, we never even thought about this stuff before. So you got to tell people, hey, you got to wear a mask. There's a 6-foot perimeter around everyone's workspace. Don't enter that perimeter. You know, I put tape on the floor because I want a visual where people can see, right? Don't be in the kitchen when someone else is being in the kitchen. Clean out clean your workspace, disinfect your workspace at least 2 or 3 times a day. Definitely at the end of your day, definitely when you come in the morning. You know, make sure that you're using hand sanitizer. So I want you to wash your hands, of course. But use hands, like every time I get off the phone now, I'm using hand sanitizer. And I swear, my hands look like I'm about 110 because they're completely wrinkled and shriveled and I have sores. I mean, it's crazy. This is the new universe. We've got to get people back safely. Resources. First of all, the California Department of Public Health. Now, this has been kind of interesting. They issued, as many of you know, on June 18th, a requirement for facial coverings. And people started asking me, well, is it an order? Is it a law? People are really going a little crazy on this mask stuff, in my opinion. They're feeling like their social liberties, many people are being, negatively impacted. And I get it. The crazy part for me is the pandemic, right? I just read on the CDC website this morning, this is an amazing statistic. If everybody did masks, social distancing, and hand washing with only 25% efficacy, we only did it right 25% of the time, 90% of the spread would be curtailed in 2 weeks. 90%. Crazy. But some of us are going kicking and screaming, and I get it. But if you're a business owner, you better do it right. Because who's on your back? OSHA, Cal OSHA. Lawyers who want to sue you for premises liability, tort damages. Don't mess with this. Get them back safely. Look at the CDPH guidance. Look at the governor's resilience roadmap. What the governor has done is set industry standards for each industry in terms of how to get people back to work safely. Now, there are common things like social distancing, masks, facial coverings, hand sanitizer. Don't come to work when you're sick. Check your symptoms in your head before you leave work every morning or before you leave for work every morning. Make sure you're well enough to go. But there are also specific industry standards. And now the CDC, as many of you probably have read, has come up with a great toolkit for employers. And they've modified a lot of their requirements in terms of how long someone needs to be quarantining, when you can bring them back. There's a lot of information. So make sure that you've got some resources you like. Of course, California has just a COVID-19 page. It's a government page with all the resources. That's a great one-stop location. We have blogs on our website where we've dealt with all of the COVID issues. We have these Wednesday webinars. But the idea is you got to find a source you're comfortable with. And honestly, try to block out almost everything else because you will be overwhelmed. I'm trying to get every piece of information I possibly can. And I feel like I'm a hamster on one of those little wheels, that I just can't. There's never a moment when I feel like, oh, yeah, I got it figured out. I think I'm going to take a break. It's just not happening, right? And check the CDC guidance frequently. Look, I know there's a states' rights issue. There's federalism concerns. I get it. But here's the bottom line. Whether you like the CDC or not, some of our top public health practitioners work for the CDC, okay? So we can talk about funding. We can talk about politics. I don't care who you support for president. It's irrelevant. You are an employer and you have employees for whom you are responsible. So you must get on board. So get to that CDC website, read the guidance. You can sign up for automatic updates. They'll come right to your email inbox. You've got to know what the rules are. Otherwise, it's sort of like telling someone who's never played baseball, which is one of my favorite sports, you're going to play baseball. You have to guess what equipment you need. You have to guess what the field is like. You have to guess what your job is. What? That's not going to work. That is what happens when employers don't pay attention to what's going on. You've got to know what the rules of engagement are. You may not like them. And if you choose to take a risk, no judgment from me. You do whatever you want to do. You run your business, you do what you want to do. But if you're not informed about your risks, if you don't know what you're supposed to be doing, that's a problem. Okay, that's all I have. I will certainly be happy to answer questions. I know that was quick, you guys, but I wanted to cram a bunch of stuff in there for you. Just keep up the good work.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jennifer. It was a lot, but very helpful. And not only did you give us legal considerations, but I found it very meaningful about the touch points with people, to check in on our people. That was very helpful. And we'll send you a Nelson mask to add to your fancy pants collection. So I know you mentioned it, but I wanted to let everybody know that you do have a series of trainings coming up, and all that information will be included at the end of the presentation as well. So thank you again, Jennifer. It was great. It was very, very helpful. This now brings us to our last speaker, Alex Tomorrow of Nelson, and Alex is going to talk to us about employment and work remote issues. So Alex, take it away.
Thank you, Chandra. Good morning, everyone. When we think about the future of employment, I think we're all curious about how remote work will play a role in our future. So let's take a moment and look a little bit at the evolution and how COVID-19 has changed the working landscape in California, the country, and the world for that matter. Three key considerations to keep in mind are: how has the rise in remote work impacted the future of employment? What opportunities are there for companies to source from a broader national and maybe global candidate base? And most importantly, for candidates, what's ahead on the landscape for them? Greater opportunities, more options, increased diversity? Companies large and small have tried for decades to make working from home a viable option. We can go to the next slide. As far back as the mid-'80s, before broadband internet, and if you remember Bill Gates' prediction that every household would have a PC, there was buzz that in the near future, we could all work without having to go into the office. In 1989, management guru Peter Drucker declared that commuting for office work would be obsolete. And that was an exciting idea, right? Remote work offered immediate benefits to both employees and executives. Employees could eliminate their tedious, costly, and ever-growing commutes, as we all know in California, and they'd be able to work the hours that suited them best. Executives, on the other hand, could help their budgets and save on high-priced real estate and have a much bigger talent pool of employees, as now geography didn't limit them. IBM saw this and was actually a pioneer back in maybe 10 years ago, I would say, and had 40% of its 386,000 employees in over 173 countries working remotely. And things seemed to go pretty well at the beginning, at least. However, when revenues started to decline a few years later, the company decided to call everyone back into the office. And IBM wasn't the only one. Many others attempted a similar approach and had to dial back their efforts and brought everybody back into the office. These included Aetna, Best Buy, Bank of America, Yahoo, AT&T, and Reddit, to name a few. Most of you might even remember back in 2013 when Yahoo CEO Marissa Mayer forced all of the employees back into the office after arriving one early morning and her parking lot was empty, only to find that it remained empty throughout the day. And her point was that many of the best decisions and collaboration come from impromptu hallway and cafeteria discussions, I quote. And I'd have to say that maybe many of us would probably agree that there's an added benefit of having people interact and socialize with one another in order to collaborate. And we should point out that collaboration was and is a key concern with remote work. And I'll circle back to this and address it later on. So slide 3, we can go to the next one. If we look at the state of remote work today and how COVID-19 has accelerated things, it's changed dramatically. Facebook expects to have half of its workforce, 50% or more, be remote as early as 2025. And if there's any indication, it'll probably happen sooner than that. The chief executive of Shopify mentioned that most of the company will permanently work remotely. Walmart's technology chief said that, quote, working virtually will be the new normal. And what an incredible and dramatic shift, right, from just a few months ago. when tech companies were spending billions on lavish campuses with gourmet cafeterias, gyms with rock climbing walls, and even dormitories so that employees would never leave. Jason Calacanis, a Silicon Valley entrepreneur and angel investor, recently mentioned on CNBC that these lavish campuses were vanity projects, right? And a way to lure top college grads away from Wall Street, maybe Hollywood and prestigious consulting firms. And it had an additional benefit, which was to keep everybody on site together as much as possible. He also mentioned that he used to believe, and as a matter of fact, he still does believe, that you really can't build a world-class product without coming in to a work environment, grinding it out shoulder to shoulder, and meeting people face to face and grinding it out, like he said. However, he recognizes and realizes that in order to attract and retain top talent, he will have to offer remote opportunities. If not, he's going to lose talent. And so, therefore, he's got to adapt. So, next slide. Thank you. If companies have to adapt, what considerations do they need to take into account to be successful? Well, let's just hit on a few of them. First of all, infrastructure. And this is not your typical brick and mortar type, but rather the technical infrastructure necessary to make a remote experience as seamless as possible. And let's not forget the importance of the cultural infrastructure as well, to make employees feel part of a team. Video, by the way, as you all know, is a great tool to keep coworkers in touch and employees engaged. Secondly, collaboration. Coming back to that point from before, right? It's always been a concern that if people are not together, how can they collaborate successfully? And by the way, without collaboration, there's no innovation. Well, a lot has changed. Collaboration programs that didn't exist in their current form just maybe a few years back, some of you would argue a few months back, are now considered essential tools. And this has made it easier to collaborate. And now, with an emphasis on remote work, I'm sure we can all agree that programs such as Slack, Microsoft Teams, Google Meet, Zoom, to mention a few, will probably get even better. I think we've seen them even get better in the weeks past. Another consideration, security. Data security takes on a new importance. When employees work outside of the corporate environment, it's important to establish data security protocols that ensure everyone follows them. You may do this maybe by making sure that all employees have the proper security software, and also, of course, make sure that it's up to date, educating them on how breaches occur and how to keep their data safe, and staying up on scams. I know that we get continuous emails at our company to warn us of a new scam that's out there or other things to be watching out for. And of course, consider endpoint protection. Next, policy framework. You may need and probably do need to update your company policies to accommodate your remote teams and reflect the differences on off-site from on-site. Call your legal, HR, IT teams and review to make sure that the information is current and make sure that you communicate any changes throughout the company. And lastly, second to last, onboarding. Probably one of the most essential and least considered. And you've got to keep this in mind because when you bring people on board, it poses new challenges. You can't just expect to throw a laptop at them and have them log on and make sure that everything's going to work out. Companies are quickly noticing that and are adapting quickly, but the end result is that your HR team needs to make sure that they're being able to get the proper information from the new employee, and the new employee needs to feel welcomed, informed, and included. Many of the onboarding steps remain the same, but we just need to make sure that you can adjust for the remote worker, such as maybe a virtual I-9, for example. And now lastly, emotional well-being. Consider the emotional well-being of your employees, as you're not going to be able to see them in the office space. And it's going to be a little different, but can be easily accomplished by maybe keeping in regular contact with employees. It seems like an easy topic to just take for granted, but sometimes we don't touch them enough. Provide timely feedback so they don't feel left out. Encourage remote employees to maybe stick to a routine. This would be very helpful so that they know when they're expected to be available, and in turn, when management is expected to be available for them. Encourage exercise and nutrition. I know it sounds funny, but if we did this when we were in the office, why not when we're remote? It might even be more important. and also acknowledge that there's going to be an impact of switching from office to home, and this is going to be real, lasting, and it's going to have its challenges that we're going to have to work through. Next slide, please. So, if remote work is here to stay, we need to ask ourselves, how will we adapt and how will companies manage their remote workers? Fundamental data shows that over the past 3 months, most organizations haven't seen a drop in productivity. Most actually saw an increase, and I think everyone on this webinar can feel that. There's several criteria that I think we need to keep in mind if we're going to be successful, and we can narrow it down to trust, accountability, and productivity. Starting off with trust, develop and maintain an environment of trust. A few ideas could be hold regular team meetings, make sure you're consistent with your regular one-on-ones, ask employees to maybe track their time, but ultimately it's about managing the work and not the people, right? It's getting the job done and the quality of the work that counts. We need to remember that. Accountability, develop and adhere to an individual development plan to hold people accountable. Develop clear KPIs to measure productivity. Set clear deliverables. Measure metrics that matter and not too many. Confirm that the metrics are measurable and scalable, and that sounds easier than it is. And lastly, productivity. In remote work, individual productivity is transparent. There's no place to hide, right? Individual productivity is exposed with no filters of in-office distractions. So remember this, if deadlines are met, it doesn't matter when the work's being done, right? This gives your employees the freedom to work at their peak hours when they are at their best, and very possibly be able to produce the very best work product. So what does the future of recruiting look like in a remote environment? Next slide. Well, companies will be able to recruit the best and most diverse talent available. It's an exciting proposition, and they're not going to be limited to commute constraints. On the other hand, when location is removed from the hiring equation, candidates can pursue more opportunities, maybe limitless, and have the potential to be able to work for any company as long as they have the required skills. And I personally believe that recruiting partners will play an essential role here with their specific ability to reach out to their extensive network and identify and attract top talent. But in most cases, I would say, companies that don't partner with recruiting firms, they're going to be limited to their network and their limited resources. They're not going to have the ability to scour the country or the world, for that matter, for the best talent. These companies will be limited to their referral network and in turn limited again to the ever-expanding talent. They will be actually excluded from the ever-expanded talent pool. At Nelson, I think we can help you build a program to manage the accountability and productivity models, in addition to helping you attract your top talent and help you navigate the remote work landscape. Next slide, please. For many organizations, remote work will be the new normal, and employees may never come back to the offices in the past. Leadership will have to guide their companies to change if they want to attract or retain their top talent. Keep in mind that many of the adjustments being highlighted here for remote work, such as clear IDPs or defined KPIs, also work for brick and mortar operations. Ultimately, solid and savvy leadership will make and mark the difference to companies and the people that they want to employ. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Alex. Very informative. You've given us a lot to think about. And if Peter Drucker could see us today, it took us a little time to make his prediction a reality, but here we are. So we are now ready for our Q&A, and just a reminder that all your questions will be anonymous, and to type your questions in the box, the question box, I think it is. So we will start. We have a lot of questions, and if we don't get to all the questions, we'll do what we did earlier this year, and we'll make sure that we send up a follow-up. But the first question is to Dr. Eiler. Dr. Eiler, the question is, how can the forecast for Q3 be so optimistic when COVID-19 infections are raging and shutdowns are likely?
Great question. And so we haven't quite seen any, let's say, evolution of the forecast that suggests that that the change in the cases is now going to lead to a generalized contraction in our economy, a la shelter-in-place policies. Most economists and most policymakers are suggesting they're going to have a little bit more focal changes in local business contraction in the sense of shutdowns, where it's not going to be generalized, but we'll see. I mean, that's why we're on the sort of knife edge right now when we've seen those cases go up. Will it lead to the conditions that were originally prescribed that would go back to a shelter in place and kind of go from a level 2.5 back to level 1 or level 0, which we're really trying to avoid? There's no doubt that we're getting close to that blade, but for right now, we think that this will be a relatively short-lived bump in the road to recovery. But we'll see how those forecasts evolve. It's an outstanding question. I don't have a straight answer because a lot of it depends on things that no one can see with pure clarity.
Thank you. And the next question is for Dr. Eiler as well. What segments do you expect to accelerate in hiring?
That's a great question. I mean, the supposition is you'll see manufacturing and healthcare, depending if, for example, the federal government also thinks about doing federal subsidization or potentially some buying. We saw today that Pfizer's getting a huge payment from the government to basically provide potential vaccines later. We might see more of that in health sciences and healthcare, and also on the manufacturing side. But construction is something to watch also. There's a lot of rumblings around Washington. We're going to see federal money come out for construction projects to try to rehire folks that might be latent in the labor force and be able to do construction-like work. Those will probably be the big three out of the gate. And the good thing about this for the American economy is those are usually larger multiplier industries in terms of dragging a lot of the economy behind it relatively more quickly than services-oriented industries. But the real trick ultimately is on the other side, where a lot of our lower wage workers are. Will those industries growing pick up enough of the slack to where we don't have structural damage in bars, restaurants, hotels, nail salons, hair salons, nonprofit organizations, community service organizations that help lower wage workers navigate their economic lives and provide other resources? That we need the economy to get working back in full recovery or closer to it to drag those other industries back up again. But we should expect some long-term structural damage in some of those industries that are lower wage and more service oriented, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you. The next question is for Jennifer. Jennifer, given some parents may not be able to go back to the office because of the school closures, do you think there will be a law passed where employers are required by law to allow remote work?
That's a great question. The idea of mandating remote work is a little bit tricky. I think the government instead has taken the approach of sort of the carrot approach. If you allow remote work, you can get tax credits. There are a lot of different things you can do. I don't think we're going to see necessarily mandating remote work. What I think we probably will see is an expansion of leave entitlements for people to do some sort of sharing with other relatives, other folks with whom they're sheltering to try to take care of the children. So I do see that coming, and I know they're in heavy negotiations. I was just looking on CNN to see if there's anything new, because there's some negotiations on that issue right now as we speak, because the childcare issue is huge for parents, particularly parents who have very busy jobs, who don't, can't necessarily telework.
And in particular, single parents, that's, adds the added stress to all that. Thank you. Alex, the next question is for you. The person typed, I'm definitely seeing a trend in the Bay Area residents moving 110 miles or so out of the area for affordability, and they're able to telecommute. Do you think this type of workers' relocation will affect salaries in California?
It's a great question, right? I remember that Facebook said that if you left California or left Silicon Valley, and they would pay you differently, because it wouldn't cost that much to be where you're at. However, there's a good chance that many people that are on this webinar have employees that have actually left the state and you don't know, right?
That's right.
So maybe I'll turn it over to the other panelists to see if there's maybe some implications with that, right? From a legal or economic standpoint, can you claw back Or does a company actually have the right to pay someone less because now they're living in Montana and they used to work for you here in Palo Alto?
Such an interesting question, right?
Better let Jennifer start on that one. You handed it off to me. Well, I think Jennifer should start because if my answer would depend on the legal ramifications.
Sure. So there certainly is, as we all know, Fair Pay Act laws, Equal Pay Act laws. There are certainly allowances for employers to pay based on geography. The way it falls apart, though, I think of my very first job as a lawyer for a big international law firm, and I was working here in Sacramento, and I was paid according to a salary differential in Sacramento, where the same lawyer in San Francisco made $50,000 a year more than I did. But every one of my cases was a San Francisco case. So we ended up saying, look, what's the point of this? And we had to have some discussions. And ultimately, management eliminated the differential because they said, look, we don't want to have to worry about who we're giving work where. We need some flexibility. So legally, I think you can do it. The question is what the morale implications are.
So perfect, because what I was going to say is that in economics, we normally think about paying against productivity. So to Jennifer's point, if she's doing the same job for the same project, but chooses to live in another place and the business has provided her the flexibility to live there, but they still want the productivity, it certainly is in the business interest to pay her less than the San Francisco-based lawyer and get the same productivity because that delta the business keeps. But Jennifer's super smart, so she said, hey, hold on a minute. I know you're keeping that delta, and that's psychotic. So two choices, either I walk or you pay me the same, and they paid her the same because they wanted to keep her. I think you can generalize that idea and say that, for places like Facebook, they may try that on the surface, but if they find that the available labor market is not as productive as the one that they had in place, they'll pay for the people they have in place regardless of their geography because they want the productivity. For the stockholders, it is the bottom line play. If the bottom line sags because you weren't willing to give the same pay for new geography, the leadership will be out, the pay differential will reverse, and they will try to keep on cooking at the same pace. And that game will get played as a friction between labor or leadership thinking about that, stockholders watching leadership thinking about that, and ultimately the worker saying, hey, if I'm super skilled and my skills are fungible, I'll walk and go some other place that's going to pay me what I need to get paid. So the market will ultimately bear that out.
Yes, the market usually, the invisible hand of the economy usually takes care of that. Yes. The next question, and this may be our last question. We'll try to squeeze in one more. This is for you, Jennifer. It's actually 3 questions. I'm going to try to summarize the theme. It's all related to stipends. So are companies offering stipends for teleworkers? You spoke about that a little bit. Is it taxable? So taxable question is number 1. Are they different for exempt and non-exempt is the second piece of it. And the next piece of it is, do we have to go back? Is it anything that we have to retro?
Okay, let's talk about the retroactivity issue first. If you haven't been reimbursing for folks who are incurring expenses by teleworking, you have a liability. But that doesn't mean you want to go back and ring the bell because it may be no one's really noticed and you might be able to just be under the radar. By the way, that doesn't mean I'm recommending that you take advantage of your employees. But here's the bottom line. If you thought you were doing the right thing and it turns out you may have should have been doing a bit more, you don't necessarily want to go backwards. That doesn't necessarily help the employee. There are tax consequences. When you just give a stipend, that is taxable. When you just give it as a reimbursement, it usually isn't, although I will say I am not a tax lawyer, so it all depends on how you have your business set up, etc. As for whether you should give different stipends for exempts and non-exempts, I think the real question is everybody pretty much doing the same thing? Do they need a computer? Do they need printer paper? Do they need ink? Do they need electricity? Do they, what are they using? And most of the time, the exempts and the non-exempts are going to be using the same amount. Now, you may decide, just as Dr. Eiler said about sort of the market speaking, that you want to retain those higher level executives. So I have companies who are sending chefs in to cook meals for their executives. I mean, they're giving all kinds of extra benefits. And it might not seem fair, but it's not illegal. because what they're doing is the business is tailoring the benefits they're giving to the folks who they really want to retain. And so, my own sense of, being fair and egalitarian kind of gets bugged by that, but I get it. And I understand why it would make sense for, if I'm a VP of HR and you really want to keep me happy, yeah, send me a manicurist and send me some food and give me a yoga instructor and I'm going to be pretty happy. So I think those are the things that we have to look at. And one of the things I think, just as kind of a final thought on this issue, that a lot of employers forget about is, I think they like the idea of segmenting the legal requirements from everything else. But I think what you've seen here today with all three of us is these are interrelated concepts. So it's not like you can just say, I'm only going to deal with legal compliance, then I'm going to deal with recruiting, then I'm going to deal with what the economy is going to look like. This is all happening at the same time. My daughter told me the other day, she's 10, and she said, Mama, the world is going too fast right now. We all need a break. And I thought, kid, I can only imagine what it looks like from your perspective, right? No school, no play dates. We go to her horse barn at 4 o'clock in the morning to make sure we don't see anybody. It's crazy. And I think for her, trying to weigh all these things is complicated. So it's going to be hard for adults as well. And I think employers need to really take some time to think about what are the most important things for their business, how did they get there, and be open to looking at all these issues at the same time.
Excellent, thank you. We actually do have time for one more question, and this is for Dr. Eiler. So Dr. Eiler, can you comment on the wine industry and how it's being affected by the slowdown in the restaurant hospitality sectors?
Absolutely, thank you. So Sonoma State University, my main employer, actually just did a study that was based on Wine Institute data about the economic impact of the contraction of the wine industry. And right now, the one thing that is at least providing some buoyance to the wine industry is off-premise sales. So people have shopped at grocery stores more, shopped at wine shops more, bought more than they would have maybe bought at a tasting room instead. The lack of travel is the one thing about the wine industry in California where they can sell more full retail. And also the restaurant industries that are wrapped around our tourism areas that sell a lot of wine during sit-down meals, those parts of the supply chain have contracted in such a way to sort of go all the way back to the vineyards and the wineries themselves. So we should expect, for better or for worse, that while there has been some positives, the negatives, at least for the next couple of years, might slow down the growth of employment, if not contract it in those industries. And there might be some structural changes in wineries in such a way that that change will linger for some time to come. The one thing about agriculture is that if you stop something hard and you reduce your capacity, it might take time for you to re-engage that capacity because it's more based on, let's say, the technology of weather and the way you configure your harvest spaces. But we will see how wineries sort of navigate through all that. For right now, we should expect that the retail ends of the supply chain contracting will certainly affect hiring and expansions at the agricultural and the manufacturing level on the other side of the supply chain for sure. And that's happening across a lot of agriculture as we speak.
Yeah, we're seeing that for sure. Thank you. Thank you very much. And audience, thank you all for such great, insightful questions, and speakers, your thoughtful responses, very helpful, and will really have an impact in our decisions that we all have to make in the near future. We are out of time, so I'm going to go through our remaining slides about resources and things of that nature. So we've compiled a list of resources that we think will be helpful to you, and you can see these when we send the link to the PowerPoint. Be on the lookout for that email, and it will be a download to our PDF, and the video recording and the PowerPoint presentation will be in that link. We will also be sending you a post-webinar survey, and I have to say from the bottom of my heart, thank you all for your feedback. That's what shapes these webinars and our Nelson Talks. So thank you, thank you, thank you. We can't do them without it. And also, I'm not going to go through the disclaimer, but as I mentioned before, please don't use our information today for medical reasons or legal advice. I highly don't recommend it, but other than, the three of you are fine, I wouldn't take it from Alex or I. So let me just say that. And then about Nelson. So I really wanted to say from a Nelson perspective that we are so fortunate to have Dr. Robert Eiler, Jennifer Shaw, and Alex join us today. So again, thank you. We really appreciate your time and the energy this takes to pull this off. So thank you. And on behalf of the Nelson team, thank you everyone for attending today. We have been in business for 50 years. This is our 50th anniversary this year. And we thought we were going to have a great party in the wine up in Nampa, but that, you know, we're going to be COVID-19. So hopefully we'll be able to do that next year. But we've made it a priority to provide resources to our communities, like this webinar. And we really remain dedicated to do that, and even more so during COVID-19. So we want everyone to stay healthy, stay safe, and thank you very much. And this is the end of today's presentation. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you.